most of us anyway. Yes, so we're heading into the last talk of this day and this morning session. After this talk, we're going to have lunch, and then we're going to go to the work groups. So I'm just going to give you a few practical bits of information first, and then I'm going to introduce Michael, who's come to talk about something that I'm really excited about, namely the attempt to experimentally dissociate the different elements that are at play when we try to do gamification design. We're going to head to lunch in the same location as yesterday, and then because some of the rooms have shifted a little bit in the building where we do the group work, so we ask you to find your group leader or the person who facilitated the discussion yesterday at around 20 past 1 over in the cafeteria, so you can find your groups there and then walk together. And my group will be facilitated by Jacob today because I have something else I need to take care of. So Michael has been very kind to come and share his work with us. Michael is a postdoctoral researcher in play and educational psychology, and in particular in game design at the Ludwig Maximilian Universität in Munich. And one of the reasons why we really wanted Michael's group represented here is that almost 10 years ago to the day, this term gamification started showing up. And with these things, it's always the entrepreneurs come in there first, and then a little later the researchers come in. And then at some point, the research starts taking shape, and we start asking not just what do they mean by this gamification thing, but how can we actually test the claims that the gamification crowd are making about what it is that they do and what it is that gameful designs and gamification-based design elements do to people from a psychological standpoint. And Michael's group has done some really, really cool attempts at trying to pull apart some of those design elements and some of those particular psychological effects. So I am looking very much forward to this.
Thanks a lot for this nice introduction. Hello everybody, it's good to be here. My name is Michael, and I will talk about gamification research and especially about open questions and future challenges. Actually, Andreas said exactly the right thing. When such a new term, such a new concept rises, it's quite typical that at first designers are using it in practice and there are nice applications out there, but research still needs a little bit more of time to starting investigating it and also to actually find empirical methods to test if the claims which are done are right. And to do so, in my opinion, we need some empirical research to just falsify or verify the claims gamification is promising to us. And so for my talk, I will focus on two guiding questions actually, which are how should gamification research be advanced? What's going on out there? What's going good? What's going bad? And how can we overcome future challenges within gamification research? So what should be done in the future and what are ways we should engage in? And to do so, I will present some of my own research I did over the couple of last years. And don't get me wrong, I will not show my research and say, this is the best research, you should do it like that. I will focus as well on the things that went well in my research, but I will also focus on the stuff where I will say, like, I would do that different now. And in my opinion, it should be done different. I will provide you with 4 key messages which conclude my claims how gamification research should be advanced, and I will bring that up during my talk. So let's get started. Gamification, I think there's no need to define that in this context here. I brought you a little nice picture. It's a little bit sarcastic, but I always like to bring this picture up. So no matter what your job is, you can always try to make it more interesting. It's really sarcastic, and it's also probably not, it's probably from the ethical perspective we heard a lot about today. It's not the best example, but that's also one part of gamification, at least from a more funny way. So gamification is the use of game design elements in non-game contexts by definition of data ding. As I said before, I won't go into detail with that because I guess you all know that. So taking some game design elements from games and applying them to a context outside games, which can be a work context, which can be a learning context, or which can be the context of day-to-day activities. So that's all included in this definition of gamification. And I also brought you a little illustration from Data Ding, which describes where gamification is set in the context of game and play, but also taking a whole game or taking only elements from games. So if you take a whole game and focus more on the game side, which is more the rule-based activities, you are at the serious games part. If you use elements from such games and are always also on the game part in the sense of rule-based activities, you are on the gamification side. There's this big play side with playful interaction on the bottom level, which can be can be seen as another endpoint of this graphic, but, and that's important, and Data Ding is also referring to that, gamification does not exclude playful interaction. It includes that for sure as well, because you can also evoke playful interactions by using rule-based mechanics. So let's start with theoretical frameworks for gamification. There are some not meta-analysis, but reviews out there from Hamari and from Seaborn, for example, who had a look at gamification research which was provided, and they found out, and I also made I put them all together and had a look at these research papers they reviewed, and they found, or I found, that only 10 of 56 studies referred to any psychological or theoretical foundation, which is quite less in my opinion. And for sure that means there is definitely still today a big need for theory-guided empirical research on gamification, and that's already my first claim. So we for sure need theory-guided empirical research on gamification, and that means we need to apply theories from psychology, from motivational psychology, from learning and instruction, which are already there. We already have these theories quite at hand, but we need to apply them to the context of gamification. And another very important thing, in my opinion, is that we need to design empirical research which uses rigor instruments and which is actually designed to validate such construct within the experiments. So, for example, if you're talking about psychological need satisfaction within a self-determination theory, you can of course refer to that construct within your theory part, but you should also investigate it in your empirical part. There are ways to assess the things you want to claim theoretically, and that's my first claim. If you think about which theories could fit to gamification research, and yeah, it's basically easy to take a look at game research and to research on games, because games, and that's quite that's quite well investigated, that games are motivationally and emotionally involving and have the power to foster motivation. So there's a lot of research about that. But if you ask the question, why is that so, there's also quite a lot of research investigating exactly that question. And the answer is games foster, in contrast to many day-to-day activities and also to many activities you are investigating in the work context, they are really good at fostering the three psychological needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And these needs are very, very much connected with intrinsic motivation, so the motivation which arises during playing games. And basically this theory is quite well established in the context of games. So why shouldn't it be also a good theory to be applied in the context of gamification research? So let's just define the three terms again to get a little bit more into the topic. So experiences of competence, what does it mean? It means feeling effective, being self-confident, and feeling to be like to experiencing feelings of success within the task you are accomplishing. Autonomy is a little bit more tricky because autonomy has actually two sides when you look at how DC and Ryan are defining it. Autonomy is at first decision freedom. So you have a lot of opportunities to engage in within a game. That's the decision freedom side, but you also have the chance to do something personal, meaningful. And DC and Ryan saying, you don't necessarily need a lot of choices to experience autonomy. If the one choice you have within a game is the one who matches your own interest, who is the option you want to go for it, then it's enough to have one. And that's the part of the task meaningfulness. So if you experience task meaningfulness, you can also have experiences of autonomy. The third one is experience of social relatedness. That means like feeling socially related to others, caring for others, or feelings of belongings. So how could actually these three and a half, four psychological needs be fostered by using gamification? So points, for example, are really easy and but also effective ways to provide immediate feedback for a situation. For example, if you think about the feedback loops you are getting at work, or the feedback loops you are getting during the day-to-day activities, almost in some ways the feedback loops are very long, or they don't even exist at some activities. So points, badges, leaderboards can provide very short feedback loops and provide you with immediate feedback, and that's something you could feel competent about. When it comes to autonomy need satisfaction, it's a little bit more tricky, but for example, within stories you can have like avatars you can choose, and also possibilities of your avatar to develop them into certain directions. And that's something you could provide feelings of autonomy in the sense of decision freedom. But also, for example, this goes also in the specialization direction. You can also use badges to develop your character or your avatar to a certain direction. But also a story framework can, for example, give the whole thing a more meaningful direction. Let's go to the last one, to the social relatedness. For example, team leaderboards could work as a way to provide a group the sense of working for the same goal. So this is about goal orientations of the whole team. And exactly the same thing applies when you have like for autonomy. You can also feel socially, or at least not socially, but related within a story framework. That's also a way of fostering social relatedness. So in the end, you get the different needs, and you get different elements which could foster that. All I presented right now was just theoretical assumptions. So to actually investigate such claims, I said, we need experimental studies. And I will show you one experimental study we did in the field of logistics. And that's one study where we assessed all the psychological needs I present right now, and also performance indicators where we can look at if actually such claims can be fulfilled within experimental designs. You see here our experimental research area. It's about logistics, and what is that? I will tell you right now. Logistics. If you talk about logistics, you normally think of trucks moving from facility to facility, but there's also something called intralogistics, which is concerned with the internal material handling. The example of IKEA is one of which I refer to quite a lot and which fits quite well. When you go to IKEA, you at first have a look at all the furniture on the upper floor, and you note the article number and you note the shelf where you can find it to pick it up later on in the big storage department. That's actually exactly what order pickers are doing the whole day. So order picking is about having a list of items you have to collect and running through a shelf system. This is now bird's eye perspective, collecting them and bringing them to a point where you can where it will be transported to the next place. So, as you might imagine, there are a lot of problems within such order picking environments, because this is a very monotonous and repetitive work context, and there's barely no self-determination in such processes. And so what are the consequences of this? You have high turnover rates for sure, and you have also low performance and increasing error rates because of low concentration, and you have low motivation of the order pickers. We thought within we want to investigate if gamification is a potential solution to actually foster motivation and performance of such order pickers in the context of order picking. So we applied an experimental design to that and applied, at first we took a control group which had the normal process of order picking, and there were no game design elements activated at all, and we also applied a gamification prototype setting which was implemented by using some screens and some environments where you could log in and develop your avatar. And in the end, we implemented in that context avatars, stories, point, badges, leaderboards, and performance graphs. So how does it look like? At first, you had to choose an avatar in the context of this order picking environment. The avatars had different attitudes, and which represented also the which influenced actually the points you were getting for being especially fast, especially accurate, or especially strong in this context. You had also a complex badge systems which with a lot of badges you could earn within that environment. You had like a scanner you were using during order picking itself. And at the beginning, as the guys who were participating in that study did not have any experiences in order picking before, you had a tutorial which introduced a fictional story of an order picking league which you had to win with your own team you were participating in that context. During working, you had all the time this view of where you could see your team points, where you could see how good is your team performing compared to others, and you had like a news feed where you see if any of your colleagues earned some badge, if you climbed a little bit higher on the leaderboard or whatsoever. So this was our context where we investigated the whole thing. let's look at the instruments and reliability. We will just have a quick look about that. So we assessed the 4 psychological needs by situational need satisfaction questionnaires, and we measured performance measures during the intervention by taking the data from the scanners. And we had like error rates, and we had like the actual performance in sense of quantity of performance, how much they picked. We had like reliability, which was at least acceptable. And we made this with students from 2 universities from Munich with 103 persons. To the results and to our research question, how far can gamification foster experience of competence, decision freedom, and meaningfulness and relatedness? So we have now the control group and the gamification group compared. Gamification group is the green one, and control group is the blue one. And we had like for all the psychological needs, we measured here significant results with regard to the gamification group. So gamification group performed better with significant effects for all the psychological needs we investigated here. Same applies to the quantity and quality of performance. We had also significant effects on the quantity and on the quality of performance. So these are quite nice results. And these results are also showing that gamification has the potential of fostering psychological need satisfaction, and also that it has the potential to foster quality and quantity of performance. But of course, there are a lot of limitations of the study as well. We only had the chance to look at short-term effects in that study. This is not a field study in the sense of we applied that for longer time within a company or whatsoever. And that's basically something a lot of researchers are having problems with. There's no insight in the effects of single game design elements or single instantiations of gamification. We just know, okay, gamification works, but what is working in this big environment with a lot of game design elements turned on? So that's the question. And that's also the problem with a lot of research done in the context of gamification. I always like to refer to examples in the context of running apps. There's Nike Plus, I guess everybody knows that. And there's, for example, Zombies Run, which is also a running app, which puts a narrative context where you have to escape from zombies to a running app. So these are actually 2 gamified applications which focus on the same activity. But when you have a more unidimensional view on gamification and say like gamification works in the context of running apps, you should differentiate what kind of instantiation of gamification you are actually talking about. And that's something which gamification research and also my study I did here is not referring to quite well, because we have no information what actually worked and what are the key success factors which apply to the single psychological needs we try to address here. So in my opinion, it's important to investigate different instantiation within experimental designs and also combinations of such in experimental designs. So what we did is we had a second study which was a simulation of such order picking environments. Still the same context, you still remember that, I guess. It's bird's eye perspective again, and we have now a simulated environment where players had to do the same process actually, but now in an experimental design with different game design elements turned on and off. And that's exactly what we did. We had like 3 groups now. We had one group which was more focused on, I call them ludic elements, like a leaderboard, a performance graph, and badges. And a narrative group which was focused on avatars, non-player characters, and stories. and a control group which only had points turned on as game design elements. So that is our try to actually differentiate a little bit more which game design elements could actually foster different psychological needs. Let's have a look at it. So here are here's the control group. You saw that before. They have only points available within their environment. And our manipulation is really, I would say, straightforward and not really focusing on you can compare the environments very well because they really just add the different game design elements within the same user interface. Here you have the group of ludic game design elements with badges, points, leaderboards, and performance graph switched on as game design elements. And the narrative group had avatar system to choose, had non-player characters here involved in this application as well, and they got at the beginning a story framework which was provided. Again, we used the same psychological need satisfaction questionnaire with, again, good or acceptable reliability measures. This time we did that with students from 3 universities, and we had like 331 students participating in that. Let's get to the results. Here again, we have like control group in green, the ludic group as blue, and the narrative group yellow. And we saw like for competence need satisfaction, indeed the elements of points, of badges, of performance graphs and leaderboard were able to foster competence need satisfaction. That's exactly also what we thought this was our hypothesis that this group will be competence fostering. Yeah. Decision freedom, unfortunately, we did not find any of the groups being different from each other. But for the task meaningfulness, and that's the result which is a little bit of unexpected, because we thought task meaningfulness, as I said before, can be fostered by a story framework or something like this. We actually found that the ludic group, again, with the points, badges, and leaderboards, had bigger values in task meaningfulness than our control group. So how can you interpret this result? It's, in our opinion, it can be that such points, such badges, points, leaderboard systems can also provide meaning to the players without necessarily having a story included within the context. And the last one is relatedness, and relatedness indeed we could foster with game design elements of the narrative group, with the avatars, with the story, and also with the non-playing characters. It's interesting that even though we don't have any real social interaction within that groups, we still had significant effects for the narrative group, which included like non-playing characters as well. So to sum that up, we have like ludic game design elements which affect competence need satisfaction, and we have like ludic game design elements which also affect meaningfulness, and we have the narrative game design elements which in our context affect experiences of relatedness. Again, there are some weaknesses of this study as well. This time we made the differentiation between different groups, but unfortunately we did not investigate. This is something I would do completely different if I would do it the next time. There has to be like 2.2 designs or 3.3 designs to investigate such things properly, and that is something I see as a proper weakness of this study. I would for sure make like investigate combinations in the next step, as this would be even more relevant for practical usement of gamification in practice. What is another limitation? Here we have no performance data analyzed within that study, which has like more practical reasons. I won't go into detail here, but this is something which should and could be very important and should be done as well. And this is also something I want to point out with my third key messages. In my opinion, it's important to not only focus on, or to investigate gamification process and gamification outcome data within experimental designs. And this means not only measuring effects during interventions. That's something I also did in my first study. I only measured the process during the intervention, but not after the intervention. If you have a proper, if you want to know something about how is gamification actually bringing gains after the gamification intervention itself, and that's something interesting, you should measure gamification outcome data also after the gamified intervention and not only during the intervention. Here again some graphical illustration of that. Time of measurement doesn't matter. So if you just measure the process data without having a look at outcome data, you confound actually the whole results by putting it into one bucket and not having a real, you cannot make any claim about how gamification actually works after interventions at all. And that's something you should have in mind as well. So when it comes to process measures, there's also, in my opinion, it's important to keep in mind that something like learning analytics are here very important at that point. And learning analytics are something which should apply to gamification and research as well, in my opinion. There should be proper outcome measures in the sense of testing and also simulations which can simulate certain tasks, but there should also be something like process measures included which are more in the field of learning analytics. So let's come back to, I call them the big questions of effects on gamification. And these are basically, as it is a young field, in my opinion, the question, does gamification work? And also, what works best? Are questions which are basically not answered properly yes. And how could they be answered? In my opinion, there is basically one way to answer them quite good, and that would be to synthesize gamification research. And synthesizing gamification research is usually, or synthesizing research in general is usually done by applying meta-analytic synthesis in different contexts. And that's something gamification research is indeed needing, in my opinion. So not only to answer the question, does it work, but also the question, what works best, can be addressed by such meta-analytic approaches by using, for example, moderator analysis within such approaches, yes. And this is basically brand new. I did some meta-analytic research in the context of learning outcomes of gamification, and I will show you some short results of that to give you an impression, to answer actually the question, does gamification work and what works best? In this analysis we had a look at learning outcomes, and learning outcomes are here defined as a relative permanent change in knowledge or behavior, which is the result of an experience. So derived from that, we differentiated between three learning outcomes we investigated within that study. These are cognitive learning outcomes, behavioral learning outcomes, and motivational learning outcomes. And our key question is, does gamification affect these outcomes? And we also had a look, as I said before, on moderators. So the moderators could be which kind of game design elements were actually applied, how many game design elements have been applied, what kind of social interaction was evoked by the intervention, and how long was the duration of the experiment which was included here. To go a little bit more into detail, game design elements, we decided to make 3 groups out of them: ludic game design elements, narrative game design elements, and combinations of both. We wanted to go into more detail. We wanted to go way more into detail, but you only can go into detail as much as the empirical studies you insert into the analysis are allowing it. And this is you cannot go deeper, to be honest, unfortunately. Amount is quite clear. Social interaction would be a no interaction, cooperation, competition, or a combination of both. And the duration, how long the intervention took actually place. I think we could skip that. We did a literature search in different databases, and we included studies which were published in English, had a experimental research design. Gamification was the independent variable, learning outcomes in kind of a way where the dependent variables and statistical data was available. We started with 5,548 identified records and excluded a lot of stuff and landed at 46 studies we included in that analysis, which is okay, but not much. For the statistical procedure, we used random effects model for the summary effect and meter regression under mixed effects for the moderator analysis. And let's go to the results. The results showed that we indeed had general effects of gamification on the different learning outcomes. Cognitive learning outcomes, motivational learning outcomes, and behavioral learning outcomes. This is Hedges G, which is an effect size indicator. So actually this is answering the question, does it work? And on a general level, this supports the claim, yes, it does work in the context of learning outcomes. Let's have a look at the moderators on the different learning outcomes. Starting with the cognitive learning outcomes, we had none of the moderators being significant for the cognitive learning outcomes. Same applies for the motivational learning outcomes. So no significant moderators for these outcomes. For the behavioral learning outcomes, we indeed had like 3 significant moderators, which were the game design elements, the amount, and the social interaction. Interestingly, the duration was not significant for all the 3 analyses we did, which means in kind of a way, or can be interpreted as there is no recency or no recency effect in the sense of it does not matter how long the gamification applications took place actually, which is also nice. But let's have a look at the 3 significant moderators. Game design elements. Here we see that ludic and narrative combinations of game design elements had bigger effects than just ludic game design elements alone in the context of behavioral learning outcomes. The amount of game design elements shows the more game design elements you use, it's shown by the data here, the more game design elements you use, the more effective the gamification applications are. Regarding social interaction, we found a significant effect between competitive, collaborative, and no social interaction, with competitive collaboration being the better group. So, in the end, if you sum that up, regarding the behavioral learning outcomes, gamification works best if you use combinations of several elements, if you use more elements, and if you combine different types of social interaction. You could also probably say the closer you're getting to a full-fledged game, the better it works. That's something you could at least interpret it from the basis of these results. But of course, you also have to be, you have to be cautious with interpreting such results, because you, as I said before, the current research has also some weaknesses, and such meta-analysis always have the problem of garbage in, garbage out. So only the quality of the data you input into such analysis also defines the quality of your output of your meta-analysis. So, does gamification work? It does work. What does work best? I think I also provided you this summary already. So, to sum up the whole talk, the first key message is have a look at theory. And I don't mean only the theory of self-determination theory. There is, for example, also a lot of stuff regarding feedback out there. For example, all the work of Hattie, it's not well applied to the context of gamification in the sense of differentiating how different feedback mechanics work in the context of gamification. Besides that, not only using gamification as a buzzword and as a word for all applications you're using, it's important to differentiate between different instantiations of such. Furthermore, not only investigating gamification in the sense of looking at the process, but process and outcome variables are important in my opinion. And the last one, focus on synthesis of gamification research. I did that for context of learning outcomes, but I think there are a lot of more ways, more contexts where gamification should be applied by synthesizing the whole research. So, thank you.